At night, in the cramped neighborhoods of the southern city, it is not bells that can be heard best, but other people's reputations. The neighbor upstairs is declared debauched, the adult craftsman is a regular customer of a brothel, and the widow in the neighboring house is a woman who receives guests too often. A couple of phrases at the market are enough to cast a sticky shadow over a person's name. They are reluctant to lend money to them. They avert their eyes on the street. They whisper after Mass. In a world where the sexual sins of adults are considered a threat to the entire community, a single denunciation is enough to start talk of a church trial and exemplary punishment, even if no one really saw anything except the light in the window and silhouettes on the stairs. Hello to everyone listening to this analysis. Write in the comments which city and country you are from, and whether you have heard the phrase that the church judged one reputation without understanding the facts. I wish you a peaceful but attentive listening experience. Next, we will examine how Raymond of Peñafort, a monk lawyer specializing in repentance and sexual sins, simultaneously created strict, almost cold rules. Without concrete evidence and a clear procedure, even the most sensational denunciation should not turn into a sentence. We are talking about the first half of the 13th century, the Kingdom of Aragon, growing trading cities, universities, and reinforced episcopal courts. From the pulpits, increasingly harsh sermons on adultery and marital infidelity among adults were being preached, but at the same time, a systematic canon law was being developed. Raymond was a Dominican, a lawyer, and an advisor to the king and the pope. On behalf of Gregory IX, he compiled the papal decretals into a single corpus, which would become a reference book for judges, and in his own Summa de Penitentiario, he described in detail how confessors and judges should deal with sexual sins, extramarital affairs, paid intimacy, violence, and abuse of power. But alongside moral judgments, he sets procedural filters. Who can accuse? What witnesses are admissible? When a rumor becomes grounds for a case, and when it is merely a cause for caution. He is particularly harsh on bad reputation and false witnesses. For him, public rumor is not evidence, but a signal. If an adult is accused of constant debauchery, the judge must check the source. Are the witnesses debtors, servants, enemies, people who would benefit from his downfall? Raymond writes explicitly that dependent and hostile witnesses cannot alone bring about a conviction. For serious charges, he requires either a clear confession, without coercion, or the testimony of several independent witnesses. If it turns out that people have slandered their neighbor out of revenge or to get rid of a debt, he suggests punishing them with fines, public refutation, or severe penance. Thus, in his model, the ecclesiastical court ceases to be a continuation of a street fight. The boundary between the confessional and the tribunal is no less important. Raymond emphasizes that a priest has no right to turn the confessions of adults into a source of evidence for an external court. What a person confesses as a sin before God should not automatically translate into a sentence of shame and fines. On the contrary, external punishment is permissible only when guilt is established outside the secrecy of confession. This line is necessary not to hide debauchery, but to prevent the court from becoming an instrument of blackmail and control over reputation. At the level of papal norms, in the drafting of which he is involved, this becomes a standard of proof. For serious sexual allegations, it is not enough that the whole neighborhood is talking. Rumor allows an investigation to be launched, but there should be no conviction without verified facts. It is here that the myth that the church judged one reputation begins to diverge from the document. In real life, neighborhood gossip could ruin a person's fate without a trial, but Raymond's texts and related decretals prescribe a different, stubborn logic. Without facts and reliable witnesses, the judge is obliged to stop, and the slanderer himself becomes the perpetrator of sin and a violator of order. Further, in specific cases, this clash between the neighborhood's demand for exemplary punishment and procedural accuracy will determine who ultimately comes under attack: the accused or those who have decided to use sexual morality as a convenient weapon in an old dispute with a neighbor. In theory, all this looks like a neat scheme, but in reality, it is like heavy air in an overcrowded neighborhood. In a typical case that Raymond's student could examine, it all starts with a denunciation of an adult neighbor, a craftsman or merchant living with a woman without marriage, receiving guests, staying late at a widow's house. The neighbors consider his lifestyle a threat. They fear that the neighborhood will get a reputation for being dirty, and with it will come inspections, fines, and the loss of privileges. Several people get together and file a complaint with the canonical judge, demanding that the street be cleaned up. In their stories, the neighbor is portrayed as a person who allegedly corrupts everyone around him, violates order, and despises church norms. They expect that this set of formulations alone will be enough for the court to quickly impose a public punishment. But the procedure that Raymond teaches the clergy step by step requires first breaking down the complaint into parts. The judge must find out who exactly saw the prohibited actions, when, and under what circumstances. In Raymond's terms, bad reputation alone is not enough. It is necessary to understand where it came from. During the interrogations, it suddenly becomes clear that two of the main witnesses are people who owe the accused money and have long been in conflict with him over rent or a joint transaction. The third is a former business partner who lost a dispute over a customer. Formally, they are all adult Christians, and formally, their words should carry weight. But according to the norms formulated in the Summa de Penitentiari and enshrined in the decretals, their dependence and enmity make their testimony suspect. Raymond prescribes a strict filter for such cases. A witness who has a direct material interest in the conviction of another cannot be the sole basis for a verdict. If all the key accusers are debtors, enemies, or competitors, the court is obliged to either seek additional, independent testimony or dismiss the case. For a neighborhood electrified by rumors, this sounds like a mockery of street honor. People are used to believing that reputation does not arise out of thin air, that if many people are talking about it, then there really is debauchery going on in the house. For a procedural lawyer who follows Raymond, on the contrary, this is a warning sign, a coincidence of interests that is too convenient. Similarly, the compiler of the decretals insists on the difference between obvious sin and what is now called lifestyle. If an adult really runs a brothel, trades in bodies, rapes dependents, as a rule, not only enemies know about it. The documents should contain testimony from people who are not connected with debtors and competitors, neighbors, servants, random witnesses. If the circle of accusers narrows to a few longtime opponents, and the rest of the neighborhood residents have only heard from them, Raymond suggests that the case should be considered suspicious. His task is not to justify sexual behavior, but to prevent the court from turning into a continuation of a personal war. He pays particular attention to oaths and torture as means of extracting confessions. The Summa and related norms emphasize that a confession extracted through fear or excessive pressure cannot be the sole basis for severe punishment. He describes situations where a person, fearing prison, is willing to sign any paper just to end the interrogation. For Raymond, this is not true repentance, but the result of coercion. In cases involving the sexual sins of adults, where shame and fear are particularly strong, he urges judges to be cautious about readiness to confess if it is achieved through threats. Where the neighborhood demands quick sacrifices, procedural doctrine slows things down. Without solid evidence, reliable witnesses, and a free confession, the court should stick to guidance and penance, not spectacular punishment. On paper, this seems cold and bureaucratic, but it is precisely in this coldness that protection from reputational damage is hidden. Raymond deliberately separates the sphere of morality from the sphere of procedure. He may consider a particular lifestyle to be a mortal sin, but in courts that operate according to his rules, this is not enough to destroy a person. It is necessary to present the facts, examine the connections, separate duty from revenge, and the neighborhood from specific witnesses. And every time a judge, relying on these norms, turns the case against the slanderers rather than against a convenient target, the grim scheme of control over bodies and reputations fails, even though on the next street, people are still whispering that the church punishes rumors. In this logic, Raymond becomes not a moralist, but an engineer of suspicion. He proposes to divide any case of debauchery into two levels: internal, where the priest works with conscience in confession, and external, where the judge has the right to intervene only if there are facts. In his schemes, the sexual sins of adults are listed in detail and condemned, but next to them, almost on the same page, are procedural caveats. If there is no persistent bad reputation, confirmed by independent witnesses, if there is no obvious scandal that disrupts the order of the community, if the victim herself does not come forward with a complaint, the court should not turn rumors into a case. For a world accustomed to thinking that the church punishes for reputation, these notes look like breaks built right into the system. When such rules are passed down to specific neighborhoods in Barcelona or another city in the Crown of Aragon, they clash with the habit of resolving everything through collective pressure. Neighbors come to the judge, confident that their collective anger is sufficient. They have long disliked an adult neighbor who does not live as they consider proper, suspecting dirty connections and gloating over his debts. They expect the judge to immediately impose a public punishment to set an example. Instead, they are asked one by one about dates, details, where they were standing, what they saw themselves, and who they heard it from. Suddenly, it becomes clear that almost all of them are relying not on personal observation, but on each other's stories, and the real facts boil down to the fact that an unmarried woman visited the house twice and late guests stayed several times. This is where the procedural accuracy that Raymond emphasizes in his treatises comes into play. He suggests that rumors based on a chain of retellings between people with debts and personal grudges are insufficient even to initiate a full-fledged process. One can limit oneself to admonishment, a reminder of the scandal, but one cannot declare a person guilty on the basis that the whole neighborhood smells debauchery. Moreover, he explicitly states that slander in cases of sexual sins is punishable in itself because it destroys reputations without evidence. If it turns out that the witnesses have a vested interest and the accusations are not supported by anything other than mutual retellings, the court must close the case and turn its attention to the accusers. In real urban practice, this turns into unpleasant surprises for those who are accustomed to using morality as a tool of pressure. In one typical case, reconstructed from diocesan records, after questioning, only the contradictory testimony of the defendant's 3 debtors remains. Other residents of the neighborhood admit that they only heard about it from them and that they personally did not see anything indecent. In such a situation, a judge working according to the norms dating back to Raymond is obliged to recognize the evidence as insufficient, drop the charges, and impose a fine on the slanderers for false denunciation and destruction of their neighbor's honor. For them, this is a blow. They came as guardians of morality, and they leave as debtors not only in private debt, but also before the ecclesiastical court. The neighborhood perceives this as a betrayal of moral order. People continue to whisper that everyone knows about the debauchery, that the court has sold out, that learned clerics are covering up for sinners with Latin formulas. But for Raymond, this outcome is precisely the meaning of reform. External law must cease to be an extension of the mob. Internal sin remains a matter of confession and repentance. Only what can be described by facts and confirmed by witnesses who are not bound by duty or revenge is brought out into the open. This does not make the world less cruel. The stigma of rumor continues to live on in narrow streets, but it provides a rare opportunity for that era to be protected from official condemnation if there is only hatred and empty words against you. In Raymond's textbooks and treatises, it all looks like dry geometry of suspicion. He analyzes what constitutes bad reputation, which is the basis for initiating proceedings. Not one screaming neighbor or 3 debtors, but a consistent reputation, when the same accusations, backed up by at least minimal facts, are heard in different places and from different people. He separates such common rumor from simple hatred and one-time gossip. In cases involving the sexual sins of adults, this is fundamental. Otherwise, any conflict over rent, debt, or a place in the market can easily turn into an accusation of debauchery. It is enough to call a person shameful and push the neighborhood to demand exemplary punishment. In practice, this means that a judge, according to the norms dating back to Raymond, must first check not the moral nature of the act, but the procedural framework. Is there real bad reputation, or are there only irritated neighbors? In his treatises, he describes the options. If the accusations come from people bound by duty, kinship, or personal conflict, their testimony cannot be considered pure enough for their voices alone to be sufficient for a conviction. Either confirmation from independent witnesses or a clear confession from the accused is required. Without this, there can be no public condemnation, fines, or corporal punishment. At the theoretical level, this looks like an attempt to introduce elements of the standard of proof, familiar from Roman law, into the ecclesiastical process. Not, it seems to us, but we can confirm. In an urban setting, these principles conflict with the expectations of the crowd and local authorities. In a neighborhood where everyone knows each other by the sound of their voice behind the wall, a few hints are enough for people to start avoiding someone. People are convinced that the ecclesiastical court should simply sanction the moral picture that has already been established. Raymond's logic, on the contrary, suggests that the court should act as a brake. First, find out whether the bad reputation is based solely on enmity and debts. In some cases that have made it into the archives, we can see how this breaks the usual order. The rector of the local church or the archdeacon, educated in the new norms, refuses to make an example of a person against whom there is nothing but the malicious gossip of interested neighbors. Then, those same neighbors begin to whisper about the judge. They accuse him of softness, of protecting debauchees, and the stigma is easily transferred from the accused to the one who dared to demand evidence. Meanwhile, in his writings, Raymond discusses not only the start of the process, but also how far it can go. He writes in detail about how a priest in confession may know about the serious sexual sins of adults, adultery, rape, exploitation of the weak, but has no right to use this knowledge as a basis for public trial if there are no other sources of information. For him, the secrecy of confession is not a rhetorical formula, but a procedural barrier. It cannot be crossed even for the sake of cleansing the neighborhood. For lay people, accustomed to thinking that the church monitors people's bedrooms through communion and confession, this sounds paradoxical. For Raymond, there is logic in this. A pastor works with the soul, a judge with facts, and mixing these levels is dangerous not only for justice, but also for the very authority of the church. Cases where accusations of debauchery are mixed with political or financial interests occupy a special place in his scheme. Raymond warns directly, if the accusers benefit from the conviction, they are released from debt, strengthen their control over the house, shop, inheritance. Their words must be checked especially rigorously. In Summa de Poenitentia and his commentaries on the decretals, he examines examples of clerics or lay people using accusations of sexual sin to get rid of a rival for a position or neighbor. In such cases, he recommends not only rejecting unproven accusations, but also punishing the slanderers themselves for abuse of spiritual jurisdiction. This overturns the popular myth that the church judged reputation. According to his model, it is precisely the attempt to damage reputation without facts that becomes a sin and an offense in itself. However, accuracy on paper does not negate cruelty on the ground. Some protocols show how courts, formally following the process, still succumb to neighborhood pressure, especially if the accusations coincide with the moral fears of the era. When it comes to relationships between priests and parishioners, brothels disguised as craft shops, or violence against addicts, judges may be willing to consider less rigorous evidence sufficient to prevent temptation. The Raymondian standard is stretched here. On the one hand, it requires hard facts, while on the other, it leaves room for interpretation of what constitutes persistent ill repute and manifest scandal. Between these formulas, there is a gray area where the decision depends on the character of the judge, his fear of theological authorities, and his desire to please the local elite. In this tense field, the myth that ecclesiastical courts allegedly punished people only for rumors and bad reputation turns out to be both true and false at the same time. In certain places and periods, moral pressure did indeed turn reputation into an almost independent category of punishment, but the texts of Raymond and his school remind us that within the system itself, there were people who tried to resist this by introducing standards of proof in the most slippery cases involving the body and desire. Their formulas did not save everyone who became the target of the neighborhood, but they did provide a rare opportunity for that era to defend oneself against official stigmatization, relying not on personal connections, but on lines of Latin text that stated in black and white, "Without facts, there can be no sentence, no matter how loudly the walls of the neighboring house scream." In one 13th century Catalan case, recorded in the bishop's archives, Raymond's entire construct is revealed almost in its entirety. In a crowded neighborhood near artisan shops, an adult man is accused of debauchery. Neighbors claim that he allegedly brings women and men to his house for unclean deeds, that his room is a place where both marital fidelity and community norms are violated. For the neighbors, this is a convenient way to relieve tension. Their homes are plagued by food shortages, debt, and overcrowding, and the thought that someone behind the wall is living too freely is more irritating than the noise of the market. Several people who have claims against him for money get together and write a denunciation to the bishop's office, demanding an example and severe punishment for sexual sin, which they describe as vaguely as possible, but with an emphasis on shame and seduction of the surrounding adult residents. The rules prepared by Raymond turn this demand into a procedure. Before passing sentence, the court must check whether there is a persistent bad reputation, whether there have been specific observations, whether the witnesses are dependent on the accused, or conversely, whether they have an interest in his downfall. The minutes note that the two main witnesses are also his debtors. Another recently lost a dispute with him over the boundary of a bench and is now clearly hostile. The mere fact of personal animosity does not deprive them of their right to speak, but it forces the judge to seek additional confirmation. Raymond explicitly warned in his treatises that a witness bound by debt or litigation is not suitable as sole evidence of a serious sin, especially one that involves not visible violence, but behavior behind closed doors. Then begins what appears to the neighborhood to be mocking slowness. The judge, educated in the Summa on repentance, is in no hurry to fill in the debauchery column in the punishment register. He sends messengers to question other neighbors, demanding clarification as to whether anyone saw not just people coming and going, but actual actions that could be unambiguously interpreted as grave sin. The reports contain answers. Someone says they heard laughter. someone else suspects illicit relations, but there are no direct observations, only impressions and hearsay. Raymond emphasized in his writings that a reputation built on rumors does not give the right to apply the most severe punishments. At most, it is a reason to talk in confession or give instruction, not to tear apart the social fabric of the neighborhood with public condemnation based on denunciation. The neighborhood, however, demands blood. For the residents, the matter has long gone beyond the legal framework. They need not so much to find out the truth as to get rid of an annoying figure and show that order is being maintained. For them, the mass of rumors alone seems to be sufficient evidence. But this is precisely where Raymond distinguishes between moral indignation and procedural reality. In his system, the court has no right to turn the general murmur of suspicion into a verdict if there is a lack of facts. He admits that a priest may insistently talk to the accused during confession, warn them about sin, and assign private penances for behavior that causes temptation in others. But public stigmatization is only possible where sin is proven either by confession or by reliable evidence, not by the emotions of neighbors. When it becomes clear that the main witnesses are indeed tied to debts and old disputes, and additional testimony boils down to retelling rumors, the case takes a different turn. In line with Raymond's writings, the court considers the possibility that the denunciation was used as a means of pressure. For him, slander is not a trifle, but a separate sin and offense, an attempt to destroy a reputation without sufficient grounds. There is a reversal in the protocol. The accused is not found innocent because he is a saint, but the case is dismissed due to lack of evidence, with the proviso that he should still behave more cautiously so as not to give cause for complaint. Instead, the informants receive fines and a warning that using accusations of sexual sins as a means of revenge will be punished by the court itself. For the neighborhood, this outcome sounds like a defeat. People who expected public punishment and spectacular repentance are forced to watch as the man they considered a debaucher returns to his home without a shameful procession or stigma. And in the end, those who demanded exemplary punishment, the loudest are the ones who pay. For Raymond and his school, on the contrary, this is the embodiment of the principle that moral condemnation should not automatically turn into a legal blow if there is no real basis for it. Sexual sins remain among the most serious in his treatises, but the procedure does not allow the neighborhood to use them as a universal weapon against an inconvenient neighbor. The image of a church that covered up debauchery may remain in the city's memory, but in the archives there will be a short record of a fine for slander and a closed case. Between these two layers lies the fine line that Raymond tried to draw. The church can continue to call sin a sin, but its court is not obliged to turn any bad reputation into a sentence if the facts have not gone beyond the whispers of others.